Let's take it to the judge, why don't we? Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano, is here. You know, I was reading through this stuff and was surprised to find that this is still an issue. It sounded like this was over.
Well, you know, this took a lot of us by surprise, Shep, and I'll tell you why. There are 45 lawsuits still out there challenging, as Shannon just so nicely explained, the employer mandate. This is the obligation of an employer to make available to his employees. In the case of a college, it would be students. In the case of a hospital, it would be patients. An array of procedures paid for by the health care provider that are against the values of the employer. In the case of, let's say, the University of Notre Dame or the Archdiocese of New York, two of these plaintiffs, it would be abortion, contraception, euthanasia. So we all thought, those of us that watched the court, that these 45 lawsuits would take their time, a trial judge would rule on them, they'd make their way to an intermediate appellate court, and maybe the Supreme Court would take it. What was so surprising today is the Supreme Court accelerated that schedule and basically said to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which already ruled on this issue, we want you to look at this again in light of our decision last June, and maybe we'll take a look at it. So the issue of whether the religious concerns can block the application of the statute is what the court will review probably next year. And faster because of what it did today.
Interesting. The other matter, areas that had discrimination, and a lot of it over the years, they can't change things without permission.
You know, the Voting Rights Act has been upheld by the Supreme Court several times, and the lower federal courts have been faithful to that. Now, there is a new challenge, and they're basically challenging the core of it. You know about this because you were raised in a state that is subject to the Voting Rights Act. Certain states, typically in the South, that have had a very bad track record when it comes to the ability of minorities to vote are subject to the oversight of the Justice Department. They want to get out from under the oversight of the Justice Department. So instead of forcing the state to get permission from the Justice Department, if there's something in the law that interferes with the rights of minorities to vote, these states want the minorities to have to challenge it just like anybody would challenge a law. They don't want Big Brother in the Justice Department telling them what to do. The Supreme Court, surprisingly, has agreed to hear that. So if the Supreme Court changes the law, that will be a radical change to remove the Justice Department from this equation. If it upholds it, we probably won't hear about this for another 25 years.
Judge, interesting.
Pleasure, Shep.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The health care debate could be headed back to the Supreme Court, and this time it would be challenged for religious reasons. But wasn't the law already upheld? Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano is here to help it all make sense. He's given me an education.
Presumably one can make sense out of all of this.
Well, because I was saying, didn't they rule on the law in its entirety, and now we can come back with these little pieces of it, and you said?
The answer to your question is basically yes. Remember, the Supreme Court in June, the outcome was a surprise to most of us who watch these things, ruled on the individual mandate that everybody have health insurance, and on the state exchanges. Congress forced the states to raise taxes and told them how to spend it. The Supreme Court weighed in on that. But this statute, Gretchen, people should remember, is 2,700 pages long. And there are many other challenges making their way through the court system to other parts of the statute. So there are 45 plaintiffs, all religious organizations, many of them Catholic, for example, the University of Notre Dame, the Archdiocese of New York, who have challenged the so-called employer mandate. The employer mandate in this statute requires employers to buy health insurance that make services available that violate the employer's values, like birth control, abortion, euthanasia. This would apply to a hospital for patients as well as employees, to a university for students as well as employees. So yesterday, the Supreme Court recognized that one of these employer mandate challenges had already made its way to a federal appellate court, and the appeals court said, we don't want to hear this. And basically, the Supreme Court said yesterday, we're about to tell the appeals court to hear this, so that it can eventually make its way to us. By doing this, the Supreme Court will be able to rule on this next year rather than 3 or 4 years from now.
But what is the messaging that you're getting from the Supreme Court that they would actually tell an appeals court below them to rule on something?
It's not unprecedented for the Supreme Court to do that. It seems unusual in this case because it's the middle of a presidential election and this is a hot topic. It tells me just a guess from knowing the thinking of the justices and having studied this for more years than I'd like to think, that perhaps the Supreme Court is going to come up with a different outcome this time around.
Really?
Remember, it only upheld 3 or 4 parts of the statute. There are many, many other parts that it could still look at. The First Amendment says Congress cannot interfere with the free exercise of religion. So can Congress force religious organizations that condemn abortions to pay for it? That's basically what the court will have to answer.
Well, the interesting thing is the Supreme Court not supposed to rule on how the American people feel about particular issues, but let's look anyway. The Rasmussen poll says the voter stance on the repeal of the health care law. They still want it done, Judge. 52%, 42% say, don't bother.
I'm not surprised at those numbers. I think the health care law has actually lost popularity throughout the political campaign. But it is going to require a Republican president and a Republican Congress to undo the individual mandate. If you're thinking, can the Supreme Court revisit the individual mandate? They can, but they probably won't. They usually don't look at the same issue twice, especially involving the constitutionality of an act of Congress.
But we could see more and more of these cases coming to them because there are 2,700 pages in the law.
Precisely.
All right, very interesting.
Soon there'll be 2,700 different cases out there.
And you'll be assigned to look at every single one of them, Judge.
Unfortunately, yes.
And come on Fox and Friends and tell us about them. Thanks very much. Glad to have you
My
on board.
pleasure, Gretchen.
All right, have a great day.
We're going to move on to this Fox News alert. Early voting begins today in the key battleground state of Ohio. There's also some breaking news, though, on a tough new voter ID requirement in Pennsylvania. A judge is now blocking that new requirement, ordering it not be enforced in the presidential election. Democrats have mounted a furious opposition to this law that requires each voter to show a valid photo ID before filling out a ballot. Republicans say it's necessary to prevent election fraud. At least for now, it's not going to happen, at least in the state of Pennsylvania. Judge Andrew Napolitano is a Fox News senior judicial analyst. So why now? Why get this ruling now? We're so close to the election, Judge.
You know, this is a great question, Jenna. This litigation started months ago, and the judge who ruled today, a couple of months ago, upheld the legislation and said it could be enforced. And then those who challenged it appealed his decision to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court of Pennsylvania took a few months, and it ruled that the judge needed to re-examine whether the enforcement of the legislation is written. You must have a state-issued ID card in order to vote, or we won't let your vote count. Whether that enforcement of that law would cause people to lose their right to vote. In looking at whether that would happen, he stated this morning he feared, no one knows for sure, he feared that it would cause people to lose their right to vote. Therefore, he's going to let the state ask you for your ID, but if you don't have one or don't produce one, you still get the right to vote. Then he's going to hold a hearing after Election Day on whether this legislation can proceed on to affect other votes in Pennsylvania next year.
It's back to business as usual in Pennsylvania, to the way that voting has been done in the past, but it's not yet over for the challenge to have voter ID be a requirement in the future.
But precisely, because what the judge did today is what we call a temporary injunction. He has stopped the enforcement for a short period of time to take it beyond this presidential election. But he may allow it to be enforced for elections in Pennsylvania in 2013. And again, the only difference when you go to the polls in Pennsylvania next month opposed to when you went last year is they will ask you for an ID. If you don't have it, you still get to vote. Somewhat of a waste of time asking for it.
With the election process this time around, will the judge use any anecdotes, evidence, anything that happens in this election process as part of his ruling for whether or not this is permanent? How will this election play, whether from either side?
I think he probably will. If the challengers to this statute can show that all of the hoopla over the legislation caused people to stay home who otherwise would go and vote, well, the public policy of Pennsylvania is that people should vote. So that's a bad thing, and that would help him to invalidate the statute. But if they can't show that anybody's right to vote was impaired by this partial enforcement, if you will, of the statute, then there's no evidence to push him in that direction. To add another level to this, there probably will be an appeal of the decision he came down with this morning back to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. They have a very short period of time
Can
in
they
which
actually
to rule.
overturn his ruling by Election Day?
Yes, they can. They have a procedure whereby they can rule in just a couple of days, and they may very well say, you know what, we're just going to let this play out, or we don't like what he did, we're going to change it to this extent.
Well, we'll see what happens in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, I just want to ask you a quick question when it comes to national law that affects us all, the health care overhaul. We heard from the Supreme Court yesterday that they had an interest in a particular case that had to do with a Christian college that doesn't want to enforce parts of the health care law because they feel in conflict with it. I hope I got that all right, Judge.
Yes.
How does that work? What is the Supreme Court doing, and what does this mean for the health care law in general?
Back in June, the Supreme Court upheld the individual mandate, which requires that everyone have health insurance. While that was going on, the challenge to the individual mandate, this Christian school, Liberty University in Virginia, challenged what's called the employer mandate. That forces all employers of a certain number of people or more to provide health care coverage for those employers that covers abortion, contraceptive services, and euthanasia. So this college basically said, well, we don't believe in any of those three things. If we purchase a health care policy for our employees that offers those services, it will violate our values. The Supreme Court has shown an interest in hearing that challenge, whether or not the employer mandate, as opposed to the individual mandate, violates the First Amendment protection, which prevents the government from interfering with your religious
Just real quick,
exercise.
if they show an interest, does that mean we see a case anytime soon, or could this be years away?
Well, if the Supreme Court had let these challenges work their way up, you're talking years away. But by what they did yesterday, we'll probably get it to the Supreme Court next year.
Wow.
And the answer to your question is no. Just because they've shown an interest in something doesn't mean they're going to affect the outcome. But they probably wouldn't do this if they weren't interested in ruling on the merits.
Very interesting, Judge. Thank you for crisscrossing both of those topics for us, as always.
A lot of crisscrossing there,
That's
Jenna.
very good. You're very clear, Judge. As I wouldn't expect nothing less, of course.
Pleasure.
Judge Napolitano, nice to have you. Greg?
Isn't that great? Two tough topics, and he made it crystal clear. Judge, thanks.
When did Mother Knows Best become Government Knows Best? The U.S. Department of Agriculture thinks its school lunch program is so great, it is now telling parents to serve the same stuff to kids at home. So is that getting a little too close to home? All rise, the judge is in the house. What do you think, Judge?
Well, I'm laughing because you said Mother Knows Best, which is really what Mayor Bloomberg is called here in New York City. Mother Bloomberg.
Well, I have heard mother, but they usually attach other.
There are other words there that we won't say on air because of his efforts to regulate what had been considered private behavior. Look, the government gets its powers, all of its powers, from the consent of the governed. We have never consented to allow any government to tell us what to eat in our homes. For the Department of Agriculture to take its authority to regulate the movement of food and interstate commerce and claim that it somehow has the authority to regulate food on our tables is unconstitutional, unfair, unlawful, and against the laws of nature, because it is accruing for itself power that we never gave to it.
All right, so I'm going to put you down as not liking this.
That's putting it mildly.
But Judge,
you know, why do we
there's
let
no
them do
way in
this?
heck they can even be doing this. I could even make a point, a stretch of a point, to say in schools, maybe. But now you're in my home. Now you're in my home.
Well, the government would like to get in our homes. You know, people don't go into government, unless you're Ron Paul, to shrink it. They go into government to use its power to regulate human behavior. Some of them believe they're regulating human behavior for the good. Others just don't like freedom.
The good argument is we get thinner, healthier, healthcare costs go down, right? That's essentially.
That's the government's argument. This is the federal government. So let me get this straight. The same federal government that cannot deliver the mail reliably to our homes wants to come in our homes and tell us what to eat, even though that's not authorized in the Constitution or by federal law.
And how would they police it? How would they?
I don't know how they would police it. They would probably put the burden on the states, so they'll bribe the states. You want money to fix your highways, money to fix your schools? Start regulating what people do in their homes. Have the police knock on the door at dinner time. Who the heck wants that?
But I'm trying to think, would they check your grocery bill? I mean, I can't. It sounds so.
It's very
There's no way to practically and without great offense police something like that.
Agreed. It's impractical. It's burdensome. The government doesn't.
But I would have said
money
the same
for it.
a couple of years ago about a city banning big gulp sodas.
Correct. And it didn't stop them from suggesting it yesterday, which is why we're talking about it today. I predict it goes nowhere, even if the president is reelected. This is beyond the pale coming into your kitchen.
I don't know. You know, there's a step to this one. You taught me more than anyone.
It's a slippery slope to the open jaws of Big Brother, on whose face there is never a smile.
Wow. Just imagine policing my basket. Like, do you really need 82 boxes of ring dings?
What did we have for dessert the time I came over for dinner?
The large ring ding.
A judge blocking Pennsylvania's effort to fight voter fraud, striking down a new law that requires all voters in that state to show a photo ID when voting. So what does this mean for the election result? This state is important, too. I want to talk to the judge, Fox News senior judicial analyst Andrew Napolitano. How you doing, Judge?
Good, Bill, and I'm not going to try and sing Hooray for Hollywood.
Right on,
you don't have
man.
to worry about
we
that.
can do that in the hallway. Drop the gavel on this Pennsylvania deal. What happened here?
All right. Pennsylvania has a demonstrated history of voter fraud. We all saw instances of it on tape on Fox News from Philadelphia 2 years ago and 4 years ago. So the legislature, in an effort to prevent voter fraud, that is intimidating people out of voting or permitting people to vote who aren't truly registered where they claim they want to vote, enacted a Pennsylvania ID law. It required that you had to have a government-issued ID in order to vote. And then it set up hundreds of places throughout the state where these would be delivered to you for free. You just had to show up, prove who you were, and you got the ID.
Hundreds.
Hundreds.
For free.
For free.
Easy stuff?
Yes. However, the trial judge looked at this and said, I think it's fair. I think it's a legitimate way to assure that there be no voter fraud. After all, the state of Pennsylvania has an obligation under the U.S. Constitution and its own Constitution to guarantee the right to vote. If it permits voter fraud, it's diluting your vote. So that decision was appealed to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, which said, well, we're worried that not everybody has enough time to get these free IDs, and therefore, even though they're registered to vote, they won't be able to vote, so we're sending it back to the trial judge. Hold a trial. He held a 2-day trial, a mini trial, in which he found not enough people have these things, and I'm worried that poor people, people in the inner city, people that don't have cars, that can't drive or even walk to these facilities won't be able to vote. So I'm going to stop the state.
So you have 5 weeks to go before an election, and this voter ID law is null and void?
Well, it's for the most part null and void, Bill. Here's the silly compromise that the judge crafted with respect to this judge who's worked very hard on the case. He's permitting voting officials to ask you for an ID, but you don't have to show one. So if you have one, you can show it. If you don't have one, you still get to vote. And then he's going to resolve this permanently after Election Day. Now, all of this will happen if his decision is not appealed by the state back to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. Bottom line, the voter fraud issues in Pennsylvania are not going to be addressed this year as the legislature wanted them addressed.
You know, you just called this ruling silly, and I hear you loud and clear.
Yes.
What about a provisional ballot? You know, if you don't have a voter ID, you can still vote, but we put that ballot to the side. Did he rule on that?
That was in the statute. That will now be moot since everybody that shows up who is registered gets to vote. There are no provisionals. Under the original statute, if you didn't have the ID, you could vote provisionally, and then if your vote might have changed the outcome after you proved who you were without the ID, they counted your vote. That's now moot. That's now out.
One more quick thing. Is there a history of voter fraud in Pennsylvania?
Yes, there is.
How bad?
Well, in 2008, there were teams of people in Philadelphia who we reported intimidated people from voting and facilitated others to vote who weren't authorized to vote. The legislature of Pennsylvania, responding to that, perhaps late in the day, but nevertheless responding to it, tried to prevent it from happening this time by requiring voter IDs. That's out.
Judge, thank you.
You're welcome.
20 electoral votes in PA.
It's a big prize for whoever gets it.
Right. Thank you, Judge.
Sure.
Jamie?
A bipartisan report from the Senate has blasted now a Homeland Security intelligence program, calling it useless and costly effort that tramples on civil liberties. The Department of Homeland Security, yes indeed, created dozens of so-called fusion centers. What are fusion centers? Well, they're set up to share intelligence across multiple departments, and they came about in the aftermath of the attacks of 9/11. Fusion centers. Sounds awesome, right? According to the bipartisan Senate investigation, the program found no potential terrorist activity, none. and often spied on innocent Americans. Department of Homeland Security spying on innocent Americans? Oh my goodness. And the cost? Up to $1 billion. The report indicates, and I quote, the subcommittee investigation found that the fusion centers often produced irrelevant, useless, and/or inappropriate intelligence reporting to DHS, and many produced no intelligence reporting whatsoever. A Homeland Security spokesman blasts the report in a statement and says, quote, the committee report on federal support for fusion centers is out of date, inaccurate, and misleading. With us now, Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano. $1 billion plus to spy on innocent Americans. Welcome to the new normal.
Right. It is the new normal, unfortunately, Shep. In fact, the Department of Homeland Security says it doesn't know how much money it spent, and it puts it at a range between $300 million and $1 billion. The Senate committee, which was signed by more Democrats than Republicans, says that $1.4 billion has been spent, that the Senate committee counted a different number of fusion centers than DHS claims it has, and that they were more dedicated to the lawless, unconstitutional violation of civil liberties by spying on people without getting search warrants than they were to developing legitimate intelligence which would help secure our freedom or our safety. Now, some of this people have been complaining about for a long time. Now we have the United States Senate saying the complaints are true. These are rogue law enforcement people serving no good, just becoming spies.
Did they forget what their directive was? Did they forget what they were supposed to do and just get all caught up in the power of being able to look down on people and see what they're doing?
Well, the directive was to enable state and local and federal intelligence and law enforcement to exchange information so that the right hand would know what the left hand was doing. But the information that they chose to exchange had next to nothing to do with national security. There was not a single meaningful allegation or indictment or prosecution for national security that came out of this. In fact, because these were federal centers, they were frequently manned by local law enforcement from a different locality. Some of these guys got bored and decided to go out on the road and enforce local laws, and suddenly they found out they weren't authorized to do so in those states. That frustrated local law enforcement because these guys were bored in the fusion centers.
This is the same Department of Homeland Security that once told us to shrink wrap our homes to keep the threat to a minimum. I'm sure people forget about that sort of thing from time to time, but is it your understanding that there is absolutely no uprising to try and do something about this government behemoth of some 90,000 plus employees?
Well, there should be an uprising now. You have Senator Lieberman, though leaving the Senate, an independent Democrat, and John McCain causing quite a stir. I don't know if anything will happen in an election year for the duration of this Congress.
I can answer that.
But I think that something will happen soon.
Well, we hope so. Are they going to run out of money? We already ran out of money, though, didn't we?
Oh, they don't know how much money they spent, Shep.
Yeah, how would they know? I mean, please. Judge, thank you, I suppose.
Pleasure, my friend.